November 21st, 1806. Inside the captured palace of the Prussian king in Berlin, Napoleon Bonaparte signs a document. It is not a treaty. It is not a declaration of war. It is something far more dangerous. It is called the Berlin Decree. History tells us Napoleon lost because he invaded Russia in winter. History tells us he was defeated by snow and cavalry and the burning of Moscow. History is wrong. Napoleon did not lose the war on a battlefield. He lost it on a balance sheet. The Berlin Decree was not a military strategy. It was an economic suicide note. And the man who tried to strangle Britain's cash flow ended up choking on his own debt? Let that sink in for a moment. The greatest military mind of his generation was not destroyed by armies. He was destroyed by accountants. We think of Napoleon as a conqueror, a man who drew the map of Europe with his sword. And he did. By 1806, he stands at the absolute summit of power. His armies have crushed Austria at Austerlitz. They have humiliated Prussia at Jena. His brothers sit on half the thrones of Europe. The French eagle flies from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Rhine. Gold flows into Paris from tribute and plunder. The imperial court drowns in silk and champagne. Napoleon commissions palaces and monuments. He crowns himself emperor in Notre Dame with a crown worth 3 million francs. The spectacle is intoxicating. The pageantry is blinding. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Napoleon's empire was a Ponzi scheme built on stolen gold and forced loans. Every victory cost more than it earned. Every occupied city drained the treasury faster than tribute could refill it. The Grand Army marched on credit. The cannons fired on borrowed money. And across the English Channel, 20 miles of cold water, sat the one enemy Napoleon could not conquer: Britain, the island nation with its oak warships and its ledger books. The nation Napoleon dismissed with contempt as a nation of shopkeepers. He was right. They were shopkeepers. But shopkeepers understand something generals do not. They understand cash flow. Napoleon realized he could not invade Britain. The Royal Navy had crushed his fleet at Trafalgar in 1805. The dream of landing the Grand Army on English soil died in the Atlantic swells. So Napoleon pivoted. If he could not conquer Britain with steel, he would strangle it with economics. He would cut off its lifeblood. He would close every port in Europe to British goods. He would seal the continent like a tomb. No cotton, no iron, no trade. He believed that Britain's power came not from soldiers, but from the gold in its banks. If he could bankrupt the shopkeepers, the war would end without another shot fired. This was the continental system. It was the first attempt at total economic warfare in modern history, and it was an addiction Napoleon could not quit. Here's how it worked. Napoleon declared every port from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean closed to British ships. Any vessel carrying British goods would be seized. Any British subject found on the continent would be arrested. All English cotton, all Manchester iron, all London manufactured goods were contraband. He sent customs officers to patrol every harbor and coastline. He turned the war from a military campaign into a bureaucratic nightmare of tariffs and inspections. Think about the scale of that. He was trying to police thousands of miles of coastline with soldiers who earned pennies a day. The antagonist in this story is not a general or a king. It is the market. And the market does not take orders. The moment Napoleon closed the ports, smuggling exploded. It became the most profitable business in Europe. British merchants set up offshore warehouses on tiny islands like Helgoland, a barren rock in the North Sea. They turned it into a floating supermarket for contraband. Every night, hundreds of small fishing boats rowed out from German and Dutch coasts under cover of darkness. They bought British cotton and sugar with gold. They rowed it back to the mainland and sold it at triple the price. The profit margins were obscene. A smuggler could make a year's wages in a single night. French customs officers were overwhelmed and underpaid. The bribes they were offered could feed their families for months. Corruption became systemic. Even Napoleon's own marshals were making fortunes selling trading licenses. Even his wife, Empress Josephine, kept buying British muslin because she preferred the quality. The system was hemorrhaging money from 1,000 cuts, and every cut made Napoleon more desperate to tighten the noose. This is where the trap closed around him. A blockade is only as strong as its weakest link. If one country allowed British goods, those goods would flood across borders and collapse the entire system. Napoleon became obsessed with plugging every leak. This obsession turned him into a tyrant. It forced him into wars he did not need. In 1807, Portugal refused to close its ports to Britain. Portugal was an ancient ally of the British crown, so Napoleon sent an army through Spain to occupy Lisbon and enforce the blockade. This triggered the Peninsular War, a brutal guerrilla conflict that would bleed France dry for 6 years. Let me give you the numbers. The Peninsular War cost Napoleon roughly 300,000 men. It drained 60 million francs a year from the treasury. He called it his Spanish ulcer. And he caught that ulcer because he was trying to enforce an economic theory. He was spending blood and gold to stop coffee and cotton from crossing borders. In 1810, his brother Louis, the King of Holland, refused to crack down on Dutch smugglers. The Dutch economy was dying under the blockade. The port of Amsterdam, once the wealthiest in Europe, had grass growing in its streets. Ships rotted at the docks. Louis begged Napoleon to ease the restrictions. Napoleon's response was to annex Holland directly into France. He deposed his own brother. He sent French customs officers to patrol Dutch canals. He was cannibalizing his own family to feed the system. But the real breaking point was Russia. Tsar Alexander I had agreed to join the continental system after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. For 3 years he obeyed, and for 3 years the Russian economy collapsed. Russia was an agrarian empire. Its wealth came from exporting timber, hemp, and grain. Its biggest customer was Britain. When Alexander closed the ports, Russian exports dropped by 70%. The value of the ruble was cut in half. Russian nobles who owned the forests and fields watched their income evaporate. They whispered that the Tsar was a puppet of Paris. Alexander was terrified. His own father had been assassinated by nobles angry over trade policy. In 1810, he made a choice. He issued tariffs on French luxury goods. He began allowing neutral American ships into Russian ports. Everyone knew those American ships carried British cargo. It was a betrayal. Napoleon saw it as an existential threat. If Russia cheated, the entire system would crumble. So Napoleon decided to invade Russia, not to conquer Moscow, not to seize territory, but to force the Tsar to close his ports. It was a police action with 600,000 soldiers. It was the largest military force ever assembled in European history, and it marched east to enforce a trade embargo. Think about the insanity of that. 500,000 men were sent to die because Britain was selling too much cotton. The numbers tell the story. To equip the Grand Army, Napoleon needed boots, coats, and muskets. The French textile industry was too slow and too expensive. So in a moment of supreme irony, the French quartermasters bought thousands of boots and coats from British manufacturers. The transaction was approved by the British government. They took Napoleon's gold with a smile. The Grand Army marched to Russia, wearing boots made in Northampton and coats woven in Yorkshire. The Russian campaign was a financial and human catastrophe. Of the 600,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 40,000 came back. The cold killed them. Hunger killed them. Typhus killed them. But what killed Napoleon's empire was the cost. The campaign burned through 150 million francs. That is roughly $6 billion in today's money. The treasury was empty. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The Allies had turned away. And while Napoleon was trapped in the snow, the continental system collapsed behind him. With the French army in Russia, enforcement of the blockade loosened. British goods poured into Baltic ports. Smugglers operated in broad daylight. The thing Napoleon went to war to prevent happened because he went to war. Here is the smoking gun. In 1813, Prussia rose up. Austria mobilized. Sweden joined the coalition. But they did not march on their own gold. They marched on British subsidies. The British government poured £42 million into the coffers of Napoleon's enemies. That is over $5 billion today. They sent muskets, gunpowder, uniforms, and cash. The wealth that the continental system had failed to destroy was now weaponized to destroy its creator. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Europe. He was outnumbered 3-1. He was defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior financing. Sovereignty is solvency. Napoleon learned that lesson too late. By March 1814, Paris had fallen. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. One of the first acts of the new French government was to abolish the continental system. The decrees were torn down. The ports were thrown open. British ships sailed into French harbors for the first time in 8 years. Contemporary accounts describe crowds cheering as coffee and sugar were unloaded. Prices dropped overnight. The common people who had spent years drinking chicory instead of coffee finally had relief. But the damage was done. France was bankrupt. The wars had cost over 2 billion francs. That debt would haunt France for generations. The final reparations from the Napoleonic Wars were not fully paid until 1873. That is 60 years of debt servicing. 2 generations of French citizens paid for Napoleon's economic experiment. And Britain? Britain emerged as the uncontested financial superpower. The Bank of England became the beating heart of global finance. The trade networks Britain built to survive the blockade, especially in South America and Asia, became the foundations of the Victorian Empire. The Royal Navy ruled the oceans unchallenged. The shopkeepers had won. The ledger had defeated the sword. There is a bitter irony in Napoleon's final exile. He spent his last years on St. Helena, a remote volcanic rock in the South Atlantic. The man who tried to lock Britain out of the world was locked away by Britain on an island in the middle of nowhere. He dictated his memoirs, justifying his decisions. He insisted the continental system would have worked if he had just had more time, if only the Russians had not betrayed him, if only the Spanish had not rebelled. He never understood the fundamental flaw. He never grasped that trade is like water. It flows where it wants. You can build a dam, but the pressure builds. Eventually, the water will rise and shatter it. The continental system was not just an economic failure. It was a lesson in the limits of political power. When a government tries to fight the economic interests of its own people, it fights a losing war. The smugglers of Helgoland, the bankers of London, and the corrupt customs officers did not carry muskets, but they defeated an emperor. They proved that in the modern world, cash is more powerful than cavalry. There is a secondary legacy, one that often gets overlooked. Because Europe was cut off from British goods, industries on the continent were forced to innovate. French scientists developed beet sugar to replace cane sugar from the Caribbean. That industry still exists today. Textile mills in Saxony and Alsace developed because they had a captive market protected from British competition. But when the war ended and the trade barriers fell, many of those industries collapsed. They could not compete. It was a brutal lesson in the dangers of protectionism and artificial markets. Napoleon spent his final days staring at the ocean, watching British supply ships come and go. He died in May 1821 at the age of 51. Some historians believe he was poisoned. Others say it was stomach cancer. But the truth is simpler. He was killed by debt and miscalculation. The continental system was a financial tourniquet that he applied to Europe, and it cut off the blood flow to his own empire. Here is the lesson. Empires do not fall because of bad generals or weak soldiers. They fall because of bad balance sheets. Wars are not won by the side with the biggest army. They are won by the side with the deepest treasury. Napoleon was a genius on the battlefield, but he was illiterate in economics. He thought he could command supply and demand like he commanded infantry. He thought he could starve Britain into submission while feeding his own empire on stolen gold. He was wrong. The British understood something Napoleon did not. They understood that wealth is not gold in a vault. Wealth is trade. Wealth is credit. Wealth is the ability to buy allies and bribe enemies and wait out a siege. Britain did not have the largest army, but it had the largest economy, and when the smoke cleared, the economy was still standing. This story matters today because the same dynamics are playing out in our world. Economic sanctions are the modern version of the continental system. Trade wars are fought not with cannons, but with tariffs and embargoes. Nations still try to weaponize their economies against their enemies, and they still learn the same hard lesson. You cannot isolate a major economy without hurting yourself. Globalization is not a policy choice. It is a force of nature. You can resist it, but the cost will break you. Napoleon tried to wall off an entire continent. He turned Europe into a prison, and in the end he was the one behind bars. The shopkeepers buried him. The ledger won, and history recorded the truth. The greatest general of his age was defeated not by winter or by cavalry, but by accountants with ledgers and bankers with gold. If you want to understand how empires really fall, you need to look past the battles and the generals. You need to look at the debt. You need to follow the money. Because when the gold runs out, the flags come down. When the treasury is empty, sovereignty is just a word, and when the ledger closes, the game is over. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you will want to be among the few who saw it coming. Empires fall in silence, unnoticed, until it is too late. Do not be the one left wondering what happened.